Now, thanks to the Minister for that address, and it leads nicely into the next part of what we want to talk about, which is, I guess, the nitty-gritty. What does the building code look like? What influence does it have on how we build? Is it leading us in the right direction? In this room, I think it's probably fairly common for people to often refer to the building code as lacking, as not inspirational, not aspirational in any way. In all of the discussions I've had with building scientists, building geeks, with the greatest of respect, that's a common phrase. So it'll be really interesting to see where that goes in the next couple of years. So Antonia Reid is the Policy Director of MBIE's Building System Performance Branch, responsible for advising the government on building regulation and then supporting the building and construction sector. A particular focus of Antonia's is building for climate change, and that program, which aims to reduce emissions from our buildings and construction and to ensure that our homes and buildings are resilient to the impacts of what we expect to be a more extreme climate. At the end of Antonia's presentation, there will be an opportunity for Q&A, so I'll come back to the stage, facilitate that. Again, use the app. If you hear something that you want a little bit more information about, use that, and then we'll have a short Q&A at the end of the session. It is my great pleasure now to welcome Antonia Reid. Thank you very much. Welcome.
Thanks very much for that welcome. It's a real pleasure to be here today. As Peter just said, I'm Policy Director at MBIE. I've been there for just nearly 3 years now in the Building Systems Performance branch, and during that time have got to know a little bit about the sector, have had a real focus on climate change and on both emissions reduction and adaptation, the challenges we have and the opportunities we have. And we'll talk a little bit about that, but also pick up from some of the Minister's comments and talk a little bit more broadly around what the government's plans and work programme is around building and construction more broadly. So hopefully this will work and I'll be able to get some slides up in a second. Maybe? I wasn't expecting this.
For over 50 years.
This is not my presentation. It looks interesting. I'm not sure if someone... Oh. Shall I try clicking past it and see what happens? No? I can just wing it without slides if that's easier. But if someone's able to help put some slides up, that would be great. I'll keep going in the interim. So as I mentioned, the government's got some big priorities and some big ambitions in the building and construction space, as Minister Penk alluded to. It's very much part of the picture in terms of supporting goals around housing growth, part of that tripod in terms of unlocking the pipeline of infrastructure and land, supporting housing affordability. In order to do that, we need to make sure that the building and construction sector is delivering to make sure that we can build houses as efficiently and effectively and cost effectively as possible. So there's a number of key areas of focus for MBIE to assist with that. One is around increasing competition for building products by opening up some mandate for overseas products to be more widely used in New Zealand. Another is around reforming the consent system. Oh, exciting. Reforming the consent system to improve efficiencies, some work around seismic resilience and ensuring that our seismic system is fit for purpose, climate change, mitigation and adaptation, and fire safety. So the first of these I wanted to talk about was the work on strengthening competition to enable more overseas products into the system. So there are 4 elements to that. The first one is around amending the legislation to better enable international standards to be recognised in New Zealand. And the second one is around enabling a more streamlined process for being able to cite standards within the building system through a new mechanism, a building product specification tool, which will allow those building products to be specified, and if a product complies with an equivalent product standard from overseas, it must be accepted for use. A third, which is around enabling a greater and easier recognition of full product certification schemes, so that's things like watermark or other equivalent schemes, which provides a simpler and easier pathway for people to have assurance that if a product meets a standard that's been recognised in an overseas jurisdiction, then it can be used with confidence in New Zealand. And the fourth element is around removing some of the barriers to making minor amendments to consents through clarifying the definition of minor variations and through the consent process and through the multi-proof scheme. So those are intended to work alongside the broader changes around products and product certification to basically mean that there's a wider range of products that can be used with confidence in New Zealand. So that high-level work has been announced by the government, and MBIE's in the process of developing the more detailed policy around that at the moment, and will be consulting through some sort of targeted public consultation over the next few months before introducing the legislation and having a select committee process with the aim of having that passed by the end of the year. So of course, in designing a regime like this, we're very mindful that we need to make sure that there are still some protections in place. And so part of the design will be, and part of the testing of the design with people like you and others in the industry, is how do we get that balance right? So how do we make sure that there's still adequate consumer protections? The mechanisms we have at the moment include things like the implied warranties, the 12-month defect repair period, the BCA assessments, which obviously still remain in terms of making sure that buildings and products comply with the building code. So that's one of the things we'll be testing. Also interested in feedback overall around how we can make sure that the system is designed well to achieve its outcomes. From a climate change point of view, we're interested in where there are opportunities here in terms of making sure that there's access and ability for low carbon, low emissions products and building systems. If there are systems that are overseas and that have been certified to an equivalent or higher standard, then how do we make it easier to use those in New Zealand as well? So the next thing that we're focusing on is really a package of things around streamlining the consenting system. So we know at the moment that the time it takes to build houses can be really lengthy, and there are multiple factors that go into that, but one among them can be the time it takes to work through the consenting system, and the government's really interested in, well, what are the things that we can do to make this simpler and easier, to make sure that we're, as much as possible, aligning things between different consenting authorities, rather than having multiple different and competing and contradictory approaches, depending on where you are in the country. How can we make sure that we're targeting the risk to the type of building, so that where things need greater scrutiny and where they need more time and consideration, we have that, but where there are opportunities to do things better, faster, quicker, more efficiently, we will do that as well. So that includes a number of things as listed there, looking at opportunities to use more remote video and photo evidence to reduce the need for physical inspections, looking at streamlined approaches across different councils to get a more streamlined experience for people working through the consent system, exploring the options of self-certification for some groups, and looking at how we can streamline code compliance certificate timeframes as well. Alongside this, the government's also recently introduced some measures to try and get some more transparency around actually what's happening with consenting timeframes. So we've begun publishing quarterly reporting on BC consenting times, and with the first of those reports published on our website in the last couple of months. One of the key purposes of that is actually to help identify where are the issues and help it inform us in terms of what are the areas where we could look to improve. And then alongside this, obviously, as part of another sort of tripod or triangle that you could think about, there's how do you make the consenting system go faster and be more efficient, but at the same time, how do you make sure that you have the right systems in place for the practitioners, both in terms of their competencies and the way they're regulated, and how do you make sure you've got the right protections in place for consumers? So all three of those things also need to work well together to have an effective system. One particular thing that we're also looking at, and this reflects what was a part of the coalition agreement between the National Party New Zealand First, is an agreement to amend the Building Act to make it easier to build small structures up to 60 square metres, sometimes known as granny flats. The idea being that by making a sort of simplified pathway for those structures where they would be exempt from consenting requirements, we can make it easier and quicker while also addressing some of the challenges we've already heard this morning around housing supply. So MB is responsible for looking at amendments to the Building Act that will facilitate this. We're working really closely with our colleagues in MFE because there are also RMA related changes that will need to be made at the same time, and we're envisaging that we'll have legislation introduced before the end of the year. This is another area where we're really interested in consulting with people to make sure that we get this right. In removing consenting requirements, there will still be some criteria that we'll need to design to make sure that those buildings are still going to be fit for purpose, safe, healthy homes. So one of the key things we're interested in is how do we do that and make sure that we design that system well. While there's some big areas of work underway, and all of the programs that I've described so far are reasonably big and chunky pieces of work that will involve changes to the Building Act or to legislation. It will take some time to work through. The government's also made a number of smaller, quicker changes to the existing system to help improve them. So one is around minor variations and customisations. I actually mentioned that earlier. Also some changes to the building accreditation regulations, which effectively make it easier for building consent authorities to focus on their core job, and some adjustments to the building levy threshold. So that followed from consultation on the levy rate last year, and we heard a lot of feedback around not reducing the levy rate, but raising the threshold. I know that people were very interested in making sure that the levy money that everyone pays when they undertake building work is used to go back into the sector to make sure we're improving things. So that change comes into force from 1 July this year. So alongside those areas of work which are really around improving efficiency, increasing competition to help make it easier to build, we also have a number of programs of work which are really around making sure that our buildings continue to be safe, durable, resilient, low emissions. And one of those pieces of work is around the seismic system. So the goal that we all want is to have buildings that are safe, that are seismically resilient, and a system for managing those that's workable and effective and fair. The government has announced a review of the earthquake-prone building system, and that is kicking off at the moment. We're just working through terms of reference for that review in terms of making sure that we are going to ask the right questions, and that's a reasonably large piece of work because there are a number of things to consider in that. So that review is expected to take till early next year to come up with some initial findings, and then any legislative changes would be progressed following that. In doing that review, we really want to make sure that we canvass a wide range of views. So there'll be those who are immediately impacted in terms of owners of earthquake-prone buildings. There'll also be territorial authorities who have responsibilities in terms of earthquake-prone buildings, and there'll be the wider sector who have interests in that as well. While that work is underway, and to provide certainty to owners of buildings who are approaching remediation deadlines, the government's also announced an intention to extend those deadlines. While the review's underway, we expect that there'll be a spectrum of owners who will be either still addressing or making decisions around what they do with their buildings. In the meantime, we also know that our knowledge around earthquakes is increasing, and the review and the release of the seismic hazard model has fed into that increased knowledge in terms of where the hazards are and the degree to which we can expect different impacts around the country. And that's helped inform a technical specification for structural design, which is a voluntary document that can be used. We also have published recently some resources for commercial building tenants. So while the review is going on into that earthquake-prone building part of the system, we're also continuing to work on that broader seismic resilience piece as well. So another key part of our work program relates to fire safety, and I note that it's just over a year since the tragic events of Loafers Lodge near to where I live in Wellington. 5 people died and 20 people were injured in that fire. And as a response to that, MBIE's been doing a number of things. So some immediate work that got underway after that tragedy, which involved reviewing and looking at boarding houses that were similar to Loafers Lodge, and we've identified and made recommendations to councils in response to those buildings. But then from a regulatory point of view, we're also looking at what are the changes that might need to be made to make our fire safety system work effectively. So kicking off a review of fire safety provisions. It will be the most comprehensive review in over 10 years. You can see a timeline there, so starting with some engagement shortly, and then developing some discussion documents and consulting on options towards the end of this year for changes in 25-26. So those changes will look at across the fire code clauses and really test have we got those settings right as well. And then the Building for Climate Change program. So climate change emissions reduction and adaptation continues to be a really important part of our work. Matthew put up the work program outline for the program in his slides earlier. We're still working with the Minister and the Government on exactly what the direction for this program will look like. So I'm not able to or about to make any announcements on that now. But what I can say is it's still clearly something that's important and that we're going to work through. The program's likely to have a few different components to it. So one is actually looking at how do we take a climate change lens to all of the initiatives that I've already talked about today. So that involves looking at all of the things I mentioned in terms of streamlining the consenting system, how do we make it, while making it easier and more efficient to build, how do we actually make it easier to build low carbon at the same time? Alongside that, I think it's important to note and sort of point out there's a range of resources that we do already have available. So a couple of things to nod to there. The technical methodologies for assessing whole of life embodied carbon and operational efficiency, which we've published over the last couple of years. There's also some great examples on our website of embodied carbon assessments which shows the areas where this has really been picked up and is underway, and various resources that we have in terms of smart steps and tips to lowering emissions. So my take from that is that there is a ton of good stuff out there, and MBIE's really only a small part of that. Yourselves and the Green Building Council have really been at the forefront in terms of developing resources, webinars, tools that are helping people to really make a shift in terms of modelling emissions and looking at ways to reduce them. And certainly in the 3 years that I've been around, I've seen that shift. From embodied carbon really being a term that few people knew or understood, to something that we're seeing increasingly being used, and people increasingly seeing the value of using those tools. There's also wider changes that we've seen in the sector over the last few years, including the low interest loans that are available for Green Star through a number of the major banks. And a real growth in that sector in terms of tools and data as well. Another point that relates to this that I think we're really seeing the benefits of is, and again Matthew pointed to this a little bit in his slides when he was talking about the holistic picture in terms of insulation in buildings and ventilation and getting the system working right, is that as people start adopting and using modelling methods, they're really seeing how you can reduce costs and achieve really efficient, high-performing homes with very little upfront cost. So for those who are in the midst of implementing or developing projects and thinking about how you use H1, what we hear consistently is that using the modelling or the calculation methods really frees you up to make trade-offs that enable you to get to a good outcome, and that there doesn't need to be a trade-off in terms of this costing a whole lot of extra money up front. So that's something we see as a real positive, and we're really keen to understand how we can support that more through the sector, whether that's through additional training or resources or through encouraging the good practice that we can see already out there. And finally, adaptation and resilience continues to be a really important part of the program as well. So I know that there's probably people who have had homes flooded in the last few days around the country. It's not that long since the extreme weather events up here and in the North Island. We know that according to Auckland University and NIWA modelling, there's around 440,000 residential buildings in New Zealand that are in flood-prone areas at risk of flooding. That's 12% of the building stock and $218 billion worth of asset value. So this isn't an issue that's going away. It's one that's going to increase as we see climate events becoming more frequent and more severe. So making sure that we've got the settings right in terms of the building system sitting inside a wider system of land and resource planning through the resource management system is going to be really important. I've just put up there some of the broader government infrastructure, so the climate change risk assessments, which was published in 2020, the National Adaptation Plan a couple of years ago, and the current government's work, which is looking at developing a national adaptation framework. Recently announced Select Committee inquiry, which is going to help unpick some of those issues around funding and financing and add to that picture as well. From MBIE's point of view, we published natural hazard guidance last year, which is intended to help councils in particular think about how to apply the natural hazard provisions under the Building Act. We also have some resources on our website around things for homeowners to think about in terms of building in a more climate resilient way. Our actions under the National Adaptation Plan build on that, with those actions including how do we get better risk assessments for buildings, how do we improve information for homeowners, and how do we make sure that our regulations and our building standards, AS and VMs, are fit for purpose, using up-to-date data and making sure that we're taking into account future climate change, not just past weather patterns. Alongside that, we know that a number of people are seeing that those natural hazard provisions at the moment were essentially designed for a different era. They weren't really designed with the kind of extreme, frequent climate events that we now have to deal with. So as part of our wider work, we're really interested in looking about what are the right settings for thinking about natural hazards in the Building Act. And as I mentioned, how do we align that with the broader settings that the government will have in terms of resource management, reform, and making sure those two systems work together as well. So there's plenty of work in that space, and it's an area that's only going to grow in importance over the next few years. I believe that's the end of my slide, and I've gone slightly over time, but there may still be some time for questions,
Yeah,
I think.
So, and we were going to set up some chairs and that sort of thing. I'm happy being here if you want to stay there.
Happy with that.
You're all good there?
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. Now, first up question, what training will be put in place for councils to enable them to understand the new products and systems without making the consenting and RFI process even more onerous?
That's a good question. So we're not quite at the stage of having figured out the detail of things like training for councils at the moment, but definitely part of what we'll be considering in the next stage. The process is basically working through the developing of that primary legislation, passing the Act by the end of the year. There'll then be regulations to put that into place. We expect to consult with people along the way as those regulations are developed, and then absolutely implementation will need to have a lot of consideration for how do we roll this out to councils.
Just following on from some of the comments from Minister Pink, so for the new products that are able to be used in the market, and this is an idea to drive competition, where is that question gone? There we go. Consenting authorities still might look to brands appraisal, yet these are very expensive and very slow to obtain. So what's the government going to do to address these issues? So if the new products are introduced, my understanding is you won't need brands appraisal for those.
That's correct. So there'll be different pathways. So
Sure.
a brands appraisal is always an option if people want to go down that. But the idea behind it is that there is other options that can provide assurance without needing that.
Okay. Is there scope to prioritise products and materials that are proven to improve health and energy efficiency and reduce carbon?
Yes, and we are very keen to get feedback on that through the process.
Right. The person who wrote that question, you can answer, you can have a chat about that one. Now, training. Will there be training put in place for councils to enable them to understand these new products and systems without, again, around that? So there will definitely be more training.
Yeah.
Now, what types or groups of organisations are likely to be able to be eligible to self-certify?
So we're looking at the moment across, there's a range of different professions, and MBIE had previously done some work on occupational regulation as a whole. So we're starting with that, but we know that there's various groups that have an interest in this, so we'll just be working through with I haven't made any decisions at the moment.
Work in progress, understandably. Yeah. Also, with regard to that, are there plans for a central regulatory body? It's widely thought that New Zealand is too small to justify the multitude of TAs. A central body would remove the lack of coherence from council to council when it comes to consenting.
So, as part of consulting on the broader regulatory consenting system last year, we got a lot of feedback around that question in terms of whether there was scope for sort of voluntary amalgamation or consistent functions across BCAs. It's something that we're considering as part of that broad option. So there's obviously a spectrum of ways that you can get consistency across councils, and yeah, that'll be part of what we're thinking about.
Fantastic. Ladies and gentlemen, Antonia Reid from MBIE. Thank you very much. Thank you.